there is clearly a distinction between blocks 2 and block 3 in the sense of the policy focus, I think is the way I would put it. Block 3 looks at inflation, whereas block 2 is more concerned with spare capacity, unemployment, recession, if you like, as the policy issue. That's a clear difference in their focus. But the two blocks are really very closely related in that they share the same analytical approach. And what I mean by that is they are both focused on the importance of aggregate demand and the behaviour of aggregate demand. In block 2, what we're concerned about is boosting aggregate demand through monetary or fiscal policy or some combination of the two in order to raise the level of output and to reduce the level of unemployment. And in block 3, in a way, we're turning that on its head and saying, well, if the problem is that you've got excess demand and this is producing symptoms of inflation, how do you deal with that problem? And the answer is, well, we reduce the inflationary pressure by reducing the level of aggregate demand and the level of output. But the apparatus that we're using all the time, the framework, if you like, the analytical framework that we're using, is always this question of aggregate demand and how that interconnects with output and with inflationary pressure if you're near full employment and stable prices if you're in a deep recession where you're nowhere near full employment. We're back in block 2 territory now, or very close to it, of course, because of the fallout from the financial crisis in 2008. But I think that there is, in understanding the relationship between the two blocks, there's quite a lot to be gained from looking at the history of economics and the history of economies themselves. The ideas about the importance of aggregate demand, which we explore in block 2 in the first instance, come of course from Keynes's general theory, which was published in 1936, General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. And that was written obviously against a background of very high unemployment and lost output, which had been going on for quite a long time in the UK. Of course, the US Great Depression is famous, but actually when you look at the record, the US Great Depression is primarily a phenomenon of the 1930s, but the UK had been stuck in this position for pretty much the 1920s as well. So Keynes's analysis grew out of that. And was focused, as we said, on inadequate demand and how you might boost demand in order to get the economy back on track. Inflation was certainly not a problem. And in fact, you can go back even before that, go back before the First World War, and if you go back, let's say, to about 1870, then between 1870 and 1914, prices fluctuate, but they fluctuate up and down. So the period from 1870 to 1914 is one of, on average, fairly stable prices. So you have, if you join that on to the interwar period and Keynes's work on the general theory, you have quite a long time period here in which inflation is not a problem. And it isn't really a problem even after the Second World War until you come to, well, we could argue about this, but somewhere around 1970 it does start to become a problem, and then you have about 25 years, well, 20 years, let's say, when it is quite a serious problem. So if we put all this together and draw the big picture, what you have is a period from about 1870 to 1970 where, taking out the two world wars, you have a period of price stability or even falling prices from time to time, but no sign of inflation as an economic problem. Inflation becomes a problem, as I said, towards the end of the 20th century, and is, in a way, a rather, if you take this long view, a rather unusual peacetime problem. Inflation is actually associated with world wars. It's only after 1970 that it becomes a major problem in peacetime. And yet, of course, well, for my generation at least, and most others who studied their economics at the same time, you can easily get the impression that inflation is it has a sort of permanent threat, almost a normal state of affairs, threatening to undermine capitalism and bring about its collapse. Keynes certainly was aware of inflation as a potential and an actual problem. In 1940, he wrote a book called How to Pay for the War, because he recognised that obviously in wartime conditions you were going to have a situation of excess demand, because you'd have every able-bodied person doing some sort of work and being paid for it, of course, but a large slice of the population not actually available to produce good peacetime goods and services. So you would have massive demand on the one hand and relatively constrained supply on the other. Inevitably, this would be an inflationary situation. So you have in this book in 1940, How to Pay for the War, Keynes's analysis of the dangers of inflation that come from this excess aggregate demand. And that's, broadly speaking, the position that we take in Block 3. So he knew about the potential dangers and also about the actual dangers. I'm trying to remember where it was now, perhaps in The Economic Consequences of the Peace, which he published in 1921. He refers to Lenin. He has a quotation from Lenin about the best way to bring down capitalism was to debauch the currency, meaning to engineer hyperinflation, that this was one sure way of wrecking the economic system. So to portray Keynes as somehow irrelevant to the study of inflation and having nothing useful to say about it, I think is certainly misleading. What we have in Block 3 is a fairly mainstream interpretation of the inflationary process, and it does owe a great deal to Keynes of the general theory and How to Pay for the War. Keynes, and of course any other economist, can be linked to one of two fundamentally opposed positions. I mean, economics, as in many other disciplines, we're used to lots of different isms. You can divide economics into various schools of thought. But fundamentally, there are two positions, of which all the others are really offshoots. And the two positions are the market optimists on the one hand, and market pessimists, of course, on the other. And the market optimists believe that free markets produce the best possible result, and therefore you want the minimum state intervention, you want the minimum of regulation. The role of the state is really just to guarantee contracts, because a free market does require people to honour the contracts that they make. So you must at least have a state which is willing to do that. But beyond that, by and large, everything else should be left to individual judgment and to the market. And this is an extreme version, if you like, of Adam Smith's famous invisible hand, which is supposed to do this wonderful coordination job invisibly and without any assistance from anybody else. And then on the other hand, as I say, you have market pessimists, of which Keynes was certainly one. And there are many more, I may say, that fall in that same category, who feel that, well, markets certainly are the best of a, well, not the best of a bad job perhaps, but certainly provide the best solution out of the various possibilities that there are. But the solution is not ideal. If you leave markets to themselves, you'll get a fair degree of chaos, and therefore what you want is a degree of intervention. And once you start with a degree of intervention, of course, the intervention becomes more effective the larger the state is. If you want to tweak aggregate demand, it's easier to do it if you've got a fairly large public sector than it is if you've only got a very small public sector. So this puts Keynes in a camp with, as I said, market pessimists and therefore believers that the state does actually have a significant role to play. And the point about all that, I think, is that it links back to some very big fundamental issues of ideology, doesn't it, really, and philosophy, if you like, and certainly politics. It's about your view of the world. And you can get steamed up about that in a way in which you probably wouldn't get steamed up about a technical argument over the size of the multiplier or the interest elasticity of investment. Those kind of disagreements also occur in economics. But I think the Keynes position is not the way that his position has developed in recent years hasn't really got much to do with technical debates. It has to do with the fact that ultimately, if you are so minded, you can link Keynes to this position about individual freedom, the role of the state. As we said in the market optimist case, all you need is the invisible hand. And Keynes would have said, if he'd thought about it, well, if you leave markets to operate without any sort of constraint, the only role for the invisible hand will be to wave us all goodbye.